On May 21st, 1927, a 5-year-old boy in Avon, South Dakota, listened to the crackling radio news that a young pilot named Charles Lindbergh had landed in Paris. George McGovern never forgot that moment. The image of Lindbergh in his helmet and goggles, alone in the spirit of St. Louis, fired something permanent in him. Like so many boys of his generation, he wanted to fly, to escape the earth, to travel faster than any man had a right to see the world from above the dust and the dirt. But for a preacher's son growing up in the Depression, with no money and no connections, it seemed an impossible dream. On December 7th, 1941, McGovern was a 19-year-old sophomore at Dakota Wesleyan, listening to the New York Philharmonic on the radio for a music appreciation class. The broadcast was interrupted by a news flash. Pearl Harbor had been bombed. He had never heard of Pearl Harbor, but he watched his father's face, saw the gravity in the way the old man turned up the volume, and knew everything had changed. The next day, without hesitation, McGovern and 10 fellow students borrowed the college president's car and drove to Omaha to enlist in the Army Air Corps. They had no uniforms yet, no training, no guarantee they would be called soon. But they had made their choice. In February 1943, after months of waiting, the orders finally came. McGovern was standing in the snow on the Wesleyan campus when Dean Smith handed him a thick envelope. He was to report to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri in 72 hours. The band played, the cheerleaders led a send-off, and his mother looked as though she were attending his funeral. He left behind the Dakota prairies, his college debates, and his fiancée Eleanor, who had agreed to wait. Ahead of him was a war he could not yet imagine, and behind him the only life he had ever known. Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, March 1943. McGovern had arrived expecting to begin flight training. Instead, he found himself in a sea of mud and cold rain, drilling under the shouted commands of old sergeants who treated every college boy like a raw recruit. The Army Air Forces called it basic training. The men called it misery. They learned close order drill, how to gas up a truck, how to throw themselves flat at the sound of a whistle, and how to keep a barrack floor so clean a man could eat off it. McGovern later said it was the most exhausting month of his life. One Saturday night, McGovern slipped away from the base and rode a bus into St. Louis. He found himself outside the Opera House, where a uniformed attendant grabbed his arm and asked if he wanted to hear a great American sing. The singer was Marian Anderson, a black contralto whom the Daughters of the American Revolution had refused to let perform in Constitution Hall. That night, Anderson stood on stage with servicemen from every branch behind her. When she sang America the Beautiful, McGovern wept. He never forgot the moment. It reminded him exactly what he was fighting for. After basic, McGovern shipped to Muskogee, Oklahoma, for primary flight training. The airplane was a PT-19, a single-engine trainer with 2 open cockpits and no canopy. The instructor, an old bush pilot named Herb Clarkson, sat in back with a cigar clamped in his teeth. McGovern had soloed once before in the civilian pilot training program, but this was different. The Army Air Forces washed out nearly half its cadets in primary. Failure meant a one-way ticket to the infantry. McGovern passed his 40-hour check ride and climbed out of the cockpit with his hands still shaking. The feeling of a first solo never got old. After primary training at Muskogee, he moved on to basic training at Coffeyville, Kansas, where the stakes grew even higher. Every man knew a bad landing or a moment of panic could end not just his flying career, but his life. One cadet pulled up too fast on takeoff, stalled, and pancaked into the runway. The fire trucks arrived in seconds. When they pulled the pilot from the wreckage, his body was burned like a lobster. McGovern watched from 200 yards away and promised himself he would not be the next name on the bulletin board. In October 1943, McGovern married Eleanor Stegeberg. She had been waiting for him through every muddy week of training, and he could not put it off any longer. They married in Woonsocket, South Dakota, in a simple ceremony. McGovern's father, a Methodist minister, officiated. The newlyweds had one suitcase between them. On their wedding night, they stayed in George's old room in the parsonage. The next day, Eleanor packed that suitcase and followed her husband to Muskogee. The Army Air Forces had told cadets not to bring their wives to training posts. There were no rooms, there was no money. but McGovern walked through town knocking on doors until an elderly couple offered a room. He and Eleanor lived on crackers and peanut butter because a bureaucratic mix-up kept her allotment from arriving. She got a job as a legal stenographer to buy clothes. They saw each other on Saturday nights and Sunday afternoons. She never complained later. McGovern said that having her there was the one thing that kept him sane through the long grind of ground school and check rides. After advanced training at Pampa, Texas, McGovern earned his wings and his commission as a second lieutenant. He was assigned to B-24 Transition School at Liberal, Kansas. When he walked into the operations room, he saw his instructor's name on the blackboard, First Lieutenant Norman Ray. Norman Ray had been the classmate who talked McGovern into taking flying lessons back at Dakota Wesleyan. Now he was a B-24 instructor who never smiled during a flight. McGovern grinned. Ray did not grin back. He said, "Do not think this is going to be easy." One night, Ray took McGovern 50 miles from Liberal in a blacked-out B-24. Then he leaned back in his seat and said, "Take me home." McGovern froze. The instruments made no sense. The radio compass felt like a foreign language. Ray told him flatly that if he could not find the field, he was washed out. No second chances. McGovern sat there in the dark, sweating inside his flight suit, and then something clicked. He remembered the procedure. He set a heading. He cross-checked the needle. The runway lights appeared dead ahead. Ray never said a word, but McGovern understood the lesson. Fear would kill you faster than flak. In the summer of 1944, McGovern reported to Mountain Home, Idaho, to join the crew he had first assembled in Lincoln, Nebraska. The co-pilot was Bill Rounds from Wichita, Kansas, a wisecracking prankster who wanted to be a fighter pilot. The navigator bombardier was Sam Adams from Milwaukee, a quiet, intense young man who planned to become a Presbyterian minister after the war. The radio operator, a Texan with a sharp wit, already had a reputation for deflating any officer's pomposity. The flight engineer, a 33-year-old from Bridgeport, Connecticut, looked old enough to be McGovern's father. McGovern had grown a beard to look older. He shaved it off after the first week. Training at Mountain Home was brutal. Formation flying at night killed 4 B-24s in one mid-air collision. 24 men died in a single explosion. The wives of married crew members lived in a barracks nearby, and every time a siren sounded, they held their breath. Eleanor McGovern was one of them. She had followed George to Idaho and now spent her days waiting for the phone to ring or the chaplain to knock. The chaplain knocked often. McGovern came home each night and held his wife, knowing that every training flight could be the one that ended it all before he ever saw a German gun. The troopship deposited McGovern and his crew at Naples Harbor in September 1944. From the deck, they saw dozens of Italian boys on the wharf, holding out their hands and shouting broken English for candy or gum. The loudspeaker cut in. The captain ordered them not to throw anything because children had drowned jumping into the water for gifts on a previous arrival. McGovern watched spindly-legged kids with pale faces and realized he was seeing a people on the edge of starvation for the first time. Outside Naples that night, he heard mothers scrounging through garbage cans for scraps of food to carry home. The crew boarded trucks for the drive east across Italy to Cerignola, a town of some 25,000 near Foggia. Mussolini's war had stripped the place bare. No young men remained. The olive groves stood neglected, and the streets were filled with gaunt women and pot-bellied children. The Americans pitched their tents among the olive trees on a former wheat field that engineers had leveled and covered with steel matting for a runway. The stone cathedral of Cerignola rose above the flat landscape, its dome visible from 10 miles away. McGovern would later come to know it as a welcome landmark on the return leg of a mission. But for now, the only thing that greeted them was mud, fleas, and the smell of a town that had no sewer system and no medicines. Within days of their arrival, the men of the 741st learned just how closely the enemy watched them. After dark, they tuned their radios to a propaganda broadcast hosted by an English-speaking woman the Americans called Axis Sally. She played Glenn Miller records and other popular music, but between the songs she spoke directly to the squadrons at Cerignola. One night she said, "We see you down there, 741st Squadron, building your mess hall. You will never get to use it." The men exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that the Germans knew their unit designations, their construction projects, and their locations with unsettling precision. Axis Sally's taunts were not empty theater. Ground crews and pilots understood that the Luftwaffe had an effective intelligence network inside Italy, and every broadcast was a reminder that the war had a long memory. For McGovern and his crew, who had not yet flown a single combat mission, the voice coming out of the radio shattered any illusion that they were anonymous newcomers. The enemy knew their squadron's name and their base. The psychological effect was immediate and lasting. Then came the first loss, and it did not happen over a target. A B-24 rolled onto the runway at Cerignola for takeoff, loaded with fuel and bombs. The pilot, still on the ground, hit the brake pedals too early, intending to stop the wheels from spinning as they retracted. The nose gear sheared off. The big Liberator nosed over and plowed into the earth, grinding through the front of the plane up past the engines. The entire crew in the forward section was killed instantly. Co-pilot Rounds, navigator Adams, and flight engineer Valco, along with the rest of the crew, sat quietly, each man working through the same question in his own mind. McGovern listened to the silence and understood that surviving 35 missions would take more than flying skill. It would take luck, discipline, and a crew that trusted each other completely. October 20th, 1944. The pre-dawn briefing at Cerignola was cold and crowded. McGovern sat with his crew as the operations officer pulled back the curtain on the map, revealing a red line stretching into the Balkans. Their first combat mission, a rail yard supplying German troops in Yugoslavia. McGovern felt his stomach tighten. For months he had trained, waited, and watched others go. Now it was his turn. The Dakota Queen lifted off at dawn, heavy with bombs and fuel. McGovern gripped the yoke, feeling the familiar vibration of the 4 Pratt & Whitney engines through his gloves. Over the Adriatic, the formation tightened. Flak began to appear ahead, gray puffs of smoke that seemed harmless until the bomber lurched from a nearby burst. McGovern held course. He heard Rounds breathing hard in the right seat. Radio operator Higgins called out altitude and heading. The target appeared, and Adams took control of the bomb site. Bombs away, the plane lightened. They returned to Cerignola that afternoon, the cathedral dome a welcome sight on the horizon. The Dakota Queen had a few holes, but was otherwise intact. McGovern climbed down, his flight suit soaked with sweat. He had handled flak. He had kept the formation. The crew was safe. But as he walked toward the debriefing tent, he watched other crews counting parachutes from a bomber that had gone down. The war above the clouds was real now. It would not stop. In early April 1945, the Dakota Queen was part of a formation assigned to bomb the Linz steelworks. Due to a navigational error, the formation missed the target and mistakenly bombed a small Austrian farmhouse instead. McGovern's own bombs destroyed the house. He did not realize this until debriefing, when intelligence photos showed a plume of smoke rising from the farm. He stared at the image of a place where a family had lived. The discovery hit the crew hard. McGovern retreated to his tent and sat alone for an hour, working through what it meant to have destroyed a home and killed civilians through his own error. Adams said nothing. Rounds offered a weak joke that died in the air. Valco checked and rechecked equipment that did not need checking. McGovern wrote a letter to Eleanor that night, trying to explain a guilt that was his alone. The war had no clean hands, but this was his mistake, and it would stay with him. He never spoke of it to the crew again. Captain Howard Surbeck was a veteran. He had flown more than 30 missions, with deep circles under his eyes and a quiet voice. He had once told McGovern he would not survive combat. The memory of that curse lingered. On a morning in November 1944, Surbeck climbed into his bomber for what was supposed to be his last mission. The formation was airborne and heading northeast, when a direct hit from flak sent his plane spiraling. There was no time to bail out. The crash killed every man on board. McGovern heard the news in the mess tent. He stood without eating for a long time, his mess kit hanging at his side. Surbeck had finished his tour. He was one mission from going home. The curse was a shattered joke now, but so was Surbeck. That night, McGovern wrote a letter to Eleanor. He did not tell her about the crash. He just told her he was alive and that he missed her. Outside the tent, the wind moved through the olive groves, carrying the sound of the cathedral bells on the night air. April 15, 1945. The briefing room at Cerignola was barely lit as the operations officer pulled back the curtain on the map. Linz, Austria, the steelworks. For McGovern and his crew, it was number 35. The Dakota Queen lifted off at dawn, heavy with bombs and fuel climbing into a cold European sky. Over the target, the flag came up thick and black, but the formation held. McGovern kept the big Liberator steady as Sam Adams called out the final seconds. Bombs away, the plane lightened. They turned for home without a scratch. The Dakota Queen touched down at Cerignola in the late afternoon. McGovern cut the engines and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The crew climbed out, grinning and slapping each other on the back. 35 missions, they had made it. That evening, the squadron gathered for a quiet celebration. McGovern allowed himself a glass of wine. The war in Europe was clearly winding down. He wrote to Eleanor that night, "It is over for me. I am coming home." In early May, word came of Germany's surrender. McGovern and his crew were processed for redeployment and boarded a ship bound for the United States. The voyage was long and crowded, but no one complained. They had done what they had come to do. The Dakota Queen, battered and patched, remained behind on the Cerignola flight line, a piece of aluminum history that would soon be scrapped. McGovern never saw her again. In the summer of 1945, McGovern stepped off the train in Mitchell, South Dakota. The town looked the same, the water tower, the Corn Palace, the Wesleyan campus. He was not the same. Eleanor was waiting at the station. In her arms was their daughter, born while he was overseas. McGovern held his child for the first time, a girl he had only seen in photographs. He had defied the odds. He had come home. McGovern had defied the odds. He had survived where Serbeck had not, but he carried with him the farmhouse in Austria. Not as a random accident, but as his own mistake. He had done his duty, but he had also killed innocence through error. Both things were true, and both would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Dakota Queen was gone, but the memory of what he had done, and what the war had demanded of him, never faded. George McGovern went on to become a United States Senator and a candidate for president. But he always said the most important thing he ever did was fly the Dakota Queen. He represented a generation of young men who left the prairies and farms of America to fight a war they did not ask for, and then came home to build the country we know today. Asked about those missions, he would sometimes shake his head and say simply, "We went, we flew, we did what we had to do. If you have a father or grandfather who served in the Army Air Forces, or if you have your own memories of that time, we would like to hear them. Share your stories in the comments below. We read every one. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us keep bringing these stories to you. Thank you for listening and for remembering.